Good afternoon, scholars. Miss Woodford here, and I am reading chapter 22 from Rump. And here we go. The girl grabbed me by the arm and yanked me inside. The first thing I noticed was a delicious smell, sweet and spicy. My stomach growled. Food, real food. The room was large, but it was many rooms in one, just like my cottage. The kitchen, the bedroom, and the sitting room all occupied their own corners of one big open room, which was bursting with colors and patterns. Sunlight poured in from 3 tall windows, their curtains intricately embroidered with vines, birds, and blossoms. 4 chairs circled a big oak table. They were painted in bright blue, violet, yellow, and green, and each was built in its own unique style and shape, as if they had been designed for very different people. A large bed took up the entire wall and was covered with a blanket woven in rich rainbow colors. The room seemed to hum as if it were alive. "Now, what is your name?" the girl asked. "No, let me guess. I love guessing games." She put her finger to her mouth and studied me. She was maybe just a few years older than me and pretty, with black curls all around her face and eyes as green as new grass. "Your name is Herbert." No, you don't look like a Herbert." "Bertram." "No, you don't have the right aura for that." "Ooh, tricky. Something unusual, one of a kind, I think. Selgelmeyer." "Wuldennecht. Rofando." "Ida, who is it?" said a voice coming through a small doorway to the right. Another woman entered who looked very much like the girl, just older. She had gray streaks in her black hair and lines around her mouth and eyes. When she saw me, she froze. Oh my. The woman closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and then opened them again. "What is it, sister?" said Ida. "Hadel, come here," the older woman shouted. Another woman came hobbling in. This one looked more like a witch to me. She wasn't so old, but she was hunched, and she had a cane, and one foot was turned in. Her face was lopsided, one eye squinting, while the other was wide. Her mouth was pinched and cross, but when her big eye was level with mine, her expression softened, and her mouth hung open. "Do you see it?" said the second woman. "See what?" said Ida. "Anna," said the lopsided witch. "Anna was my mother," I explained, and Ida gasped. It was as if they had all been frozen by some spell, shocked into silence. I felt like an idiot. Finally, Ida broke into a laugh. "Nephew!" She rushed to me and crushed me against her, which might have felt comforting if I could breathe. When she released me, she squeezed my cheeks between her hands and said, "Isn't he beautiful, our nephew? Sisters, Anna has a son." Who could have ever known? The second sister blinked and came to me. She reached out a finger and lifted my chin. "He looks very much like Anna, doesn't he?" Hadel finally broke from her stupor as well, but she didn't come to me. She paused, looking me over with one big eye, and then grumbled, "I don't see it has something to rejoice over." She hobbled out of the room. Ida's cheerful face fell, and her older sister looked at me with a suspicious frown. This was a mistake. They didn't want me here. I shouldn't have come. I took a step back, but Ida caught me by the shoulder. "Oh, don't mind her, dear nephew," said Ida. "She has always been crabby. This is Bathilda. We are so glad you came to us. You may call me Auntie Ida. Come and have Ida, we know nothing of this boy," Bathilda cut in. "Where he came from, how he found us, or even what his name is." "His name?" Ida's face darkened. "I've been unable to guess it. So curious. I'm usually spot on." I looked between them. I was so tired. The idea of trying to explain my name and everything else overwhelmed me. I didn't really want to see the look on their faces. "My name is Robert." Bathilda furrowed her brow, confused. "Well," said Ida, looking disappointed, "I never would have guessed that." "How is it that you found us, Robert?" asked Bathilda. "I asked in the village about my mother. Nobody remembered her, but when I asked about spinning—" Bathilda stiffened but nodded. They must know about my mother's spinning. "Oh, but come eat cake and see what we are making." Ida dragged me through a small corridor leading to another room, but Hadel barred the doorway with her walking stick. "You're filthy," she growled. "Hadel, Robert is our nephew and our guest." Hadel's big eyes looked me up and down, and I felt that she could see every secret I held. "Huh, Robert, you'll take a bath before you set foot in here. You look like you grew from dirt." The bathtub was in a corner of the kitchen. Bathilda poured hot water in the tub and held out soap and a brush to scrub myself. Then she and Ida left the room through the doorway where Hadel had gone. After I washed, my clothes were hanging to dry by the fire, so I wrapped myself in a quilt sewn with 100 different colors. "I made that," said Ida when she returned. "Do you like it?" "How do you get so many colors?" I asked, brushing my hand over the intricate patterns. "It's all in the fingertips. Wait until you see what I'm working on now." While my clothes dried, Ida fed me as much food as I could shove in my mouth, which was a lot. Not only had I forgotten what it was like to be clean, I had forgotten what it was like to eat real food instead of wormy sludge. And this food was even better than the food I remembered eating, better than Martha's meat pies or Red's granny's stew. It was certainly better than sludge. There were beets and potatoes sprinkled with herbs and cheese, fresh bread, and milk. I'd never had cake before, but it turned out to be sort of bread that was sweet and crumbly. I had 3 helpings. I was feeling rather sleepy after I ate, especially when I put on my warm, freshly cleaned clothes. But Ida had other ideas. She pulled me into the other room where Hadel and Bathilda were. I stopped in the doorway and gaped. Hadel sat at a spinning wheel, and piled at her feet were skeins of threads and colors with no dye could make. Red, brighter than strawberries, yellow like sunshine, blue like the morning sky, and blue like deep water, green like the forest leaves, and all shades in between, colors I had never seen in the world. Bathilda was knitting what looked like a shawl, creating a fluid and intricate pattern from Hadel's rich threads. She worked with such speed and rhythm, her fingers and knitting needles became a blur. But what amazed me the most were the tapestries. Every inch of the wall was covered with bright pictures full of life. A white unicorn in a field of orange poppies, dancing princesses, a knight shielding the red fire of a dragon, a maiden in a tower. In the middle of the room was a big loom strung with varying shades of threads. Ida went and sat behind the loom, moving her hands across the strings, weaving her threads in and out and around each other. As she drew the fibers together, they created vibrant pictures, birds and pixies and flowers, and they were so lifelike they seemed to breathe and move as if in a gentle breeze. Surely this was magic. Magic like how I spun the gold and how my mother had. As I watched, I had a tingling sensation in my toes and my fingers, in my head and my chest. This was where everything started, and I started. It all began with my mother, and she began here. "How does it work?" I asked. "Enchantments," Ida said with a thrill in her voice. "Magic." "Ida," said Bathilda. It sounded like a warning. "We do more of our own work than the magic does," says Ida. "We just allow enough enchantments to give the fibers just a nudge." "You're nudging a little hard there, don't you think?" said Hadel. She had been spinning wool into a gentle shade of lavender, but as she spoke, the color deepened to a violent purple. It will fetch a good price at the market, said Ida. Yes, but at what cost to you? Oh, Hadel, you worry so much. There is no greed or pride in this, only beauty. Hadel glared at the tapestry but continued with her spinning, and as she fell back into the rhythm, her threads lightened back to lavender. Can you only change the color of the threads, I asked, or can you change what they're made of? A little, but not too much. I would never be so foolish or greedy. She eyed me, and again I felt that she could see right down inside me to the foolishness and greed that had gotten me into so much trouble. Hadel's very cautious, said Ida. We would all do well to be cautious, considering what happened to his mother, Hadel said, nodding toward me. Bathilda put her knitting down. Hadel, it could happen to anyone foolish enough to be so greedy. Anyone can be greedy, said Ida. Clearly, said Hadel. Excuse me, I said, but I never knew my mother. Oh, you poor thing. We are being insensitive, said Ida. She dropped her work and rushed to comfort me. No, it isn't that. It's just, well, I hardly know anything about her. I know that she was from yonder and that she could spin. Her spinning wasn't like other people's, but how was she foolish and greedy? The three aunts stopped what they were doing and exchanged looks. Did she make any of this? I asked, pointing to the tapestries and yarns. No, said Bathilda. She traded everything she made, including her soul, mumbled Hadel under her breath. Hadel, gasped Ida. Our poor nephew. Well, he's poor because of her. Don't you think he has a right to know? They all fell silent. Bathilda and Ida stared at the ground, but Hadel watched me, her big eye twitching. I know about her spinning, I spoke up again, dancing around the questions I most wanted to ask. I wanted to know what had happened to my mother. I wanted to know if there was anything that could be done about my problems, but I couldn't decide how much I wanted them to know about me. I know that she could spin valuable things. Will you tell me what happened to her? Greed, said Hadel. Greed and magic sucked her in and spun her to death. Hadel, be sensitive, said Ida. Well, it's the truth. You were too young to understand. Ida opened her mouth in protest, but Bathilda cut her off. She was a fine spinner, said Bathilda in a gentle voice. The finest there has ever been in yonder or anywhere. Bathilda glared at Hadel and began again. I will say she was unwise and a bit overly confident. Even though she was a fine spinner, and that is where the trouble began. You see, Robert, in our work we must balance the skill of our own hands with the magic we use to transform the threads. She held out her knitting as if to show me. We do not call for more magic than we have skill, because then we lose control of the outcome. We lose control of ourselves. I thought of poor Kessler, and the sick dread in my stomach returned. Anna knew this, but she always pushed the limits. She was always experimenting. How? I asked. Bathilda put down her knitting and swept a strand of graying hair back from her face. Your mother could spin wool into velvet and grass into silk, beautiful threads. Her work was much admired, but we feared she was losing balance. Yet somehow it never seemed to affect her. She always managed to bargain well at the markets. So in spite of our warnings, Anna came to believe that her skill was more powerful than any magic. She thought she could control it, you mean? Bathilda nodded. One day Anna told a wealthy merchant that she could spin any worthless thing into something beautiful and valuable. Well, he took her at her word. He had a bundle of straw in his cart and said he would be pleased with her skill only if she could turn the straw into gold. He promised her a fair trade if she could fulfill that task. I warned her, that fool, but she was all pride and greed. It was dangerous, to be sure, continued Bathilda, but she couldn't have known just how dangerous, said Ida. It wasn't her fault. That merchant was the greedy one. Well, when she told me of the bargain she had made, I truly hoped she would fail, said Bathilda. Velvet and linen and silk were one thing, but gold? I didn't think it was possible. I hoped it wasn't. But to my dismay, Anna succeeded beyond what I could ever have imagined. She spun that straw into gold, into perfect glimmering skeins of gold, more pure than any gold in the kingdom. But even her skill could not match the enormous magic of spinning straw into gold. All three sisters looked down, filled with an unspoken grief. Was the merchant's trade fair? I asked. Hada blew through her lips like a horse. Fair? That man swindled her to pieces. When he came and demanded what she had made of his straw, of course he was delighted. And what's more, Anna had no power to demand a fair bargain. That's what happens when you get greedy with the magic. You lose control. The merchant gave her a sack of grain for her pile of gold, declaring that it was a fair trade. For without his straw, she would have had nothing to spin, he said. I shivered, remembering the first time I had traded with the miller, how my tongue had swelled in my mouth, and I mechanically accepted his bargain. I didn't understand then what it all meant. I remember that day, said Ida. I was small, but I remember her nearly fainting as she held that sack of grain. Her face, she looked as though she had seen death. You think she would have stopped there, said Hoddle, but no, she was determined to be the greediest wench there ever was. Hoddle, you mustn't speak of our sister. She only thought to remedy her mistake, said Ida. Yes, well, it didn't work, did it? I felt as if all my past troubles were being laid out before me, troubles I well knew, and I was waiting, hoping for them to tell me the solution. What happened? Bathilda's eyes glistened with tears. She fumbled with her knitting and brought it close to her face as if her work would keep her emotions at bay. She didn't believe she had lost control because of the magic. She claimed it was because a merchant had given her the straw. So she spun more gold, this time from her own straw, thinking she could negotiate the terms of the trade, but she couldn't. She took that gold thread to the markets and sold it for a pittance. People always start a bargain ridiculously low, and Anna had no power to refuse or suggest a price. Whatever they offered, she had to take, and the gold was theirs. I knew that feeling. I was blind to it at first. But with Opal, I recalled the powerlessness I felt at not being able to suggest a trade or even refuse one. I thought abominable. Then the merchant returned, growled, Hoddle. Yes, that was truly the worst part, said Bathilda. He returned with a wagon full of straw for Anna to spin, said Ida. I remember that. So much straw. And I knew what he wanted. I knew. The merchant was sounding a lot like the miller. Anna refused, said Bathilda, but the merchant told her he was on the way to the kingdom, and he was certain that King Hubertus, the ruler at the time, would be interested to know Anna's great skill. It was a threat she couldn't live with. Anna was so fiercely independent, and she knew that any king would want to use her skill for his own gain. So she spun the gold for the merchant once more, and for payment he gave her a new spinning wheel, so that she might spin for him on more occasions. Rumple, said Hoddle. She was locked in a rumple then. Her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear her. What? She was locked in what? Rumple. That's what we call our own work sometimes. It means wrapped or trapped in magic. We wrap our work in magic, only your mother did it to herself. She spun herself in magic so tight it killed her. Oh, Hoddle, that's ridiculous, said Ida. A person can't be trapped in a rumple. And I'm sure Anna didn't spin again once she left. She probably died in childbirth. She died right after I was born, I said. See, You think that, Ida, if it gives you comfort, but I say once you've become unbalanced in the magic, Rumple grabs you and spins you fast and tight, so that it's impossible to get out. It suffocates you. She was never free of it, no matter what she died from. A Rumple never lets go. Hoddle fixed her crooked gaze on me until a chill ran up my neck and through my bones. What happened then, I asked. She knew the merchant would never leave her alone, so she ran away that very afternoon. She told no one where she was going, and she took nothing with her but the wheel from the merchant. I begged her not to go, said Ida, as she wiped tears from her eyes. I ran down the road crying for her. I waited outside for days for her to return. Ooh, I'd like to wrap my threads around that merchant's fat, greedy neck. She twisted the threads in her hands. The last we heard was that she had married a man from far away, and she died shortly after of illness. We never knew she had a son. They kept talking, but their words faded from me. Rumple. Was that what my mother had named me? Because she was trapped in the magic and she knew I would be too? It made sense to me, but it didn't bring me any comfort. I didn't feel like more of a person, smarter or bigger, like I had always hoped I would. I felt smaller and more alone than ever. Come, Robert, you must be exhausted. Ida pulled me to my feet and led me back to the kitchen. Here we are, nice and cozy. In a corner near the hearth, there was a little bed made of a pile of straw and 2 blankets woven with blue and green wool. I stared at the straw and shivered. Ida frowned and bit her lip. My sisters and I share a bed. I'm sorry we don't have another. I thought you would be comfortable here. Oh, I said, forcing a smile. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. It's wonderful, really. Straw is so warm. Ida stared at me for a moment. She had been so kind and excited when I came, but now I could see the weariness in her eyes, too. Good night, Robert. She left me with only the last glows of the coals for light. Every part of me was exhausted as I slumped down in the straw bed and closed my eyes. I was too tired to think. The only thing I had in my mind as I drifted off to sleep was the drumming of a single word over and over. Rumple, rumple, rumple. And that concludes chapter 22. I hope you enjoyed it.